Coming up, they are among the forgotten victims of World War II, and only now is their incredible story being told. They were America's single largest minority, and overnight they became the enemy.
The American dream came to a screeching halt.
Restricted, excluded, and even imprisoned, not for what they did, but for what they might do.
It was a time of trauma. It was a time of trial. It was a time that we really cannot forget.
The internment of more than 100,000 Japanese Americans during World War II is well known. Less known is that Italians and Italian Americans were also imprisoned, branded as enemy aliens, forced to give up their homes, and punished by the same country that had once welcomed them. It is a dark, underreported chapter in American history. Join us for Italian-American Internment, a secret story.
For more than 40 years, the Broadway market in Missoula, Montana has been owned by Alfredo Cipolato. It seems an unlikely destination for a man who came from Venice, Italy, especially when you realize that the first time Alfredo Cipolato saw Missoula, he was a prisoner of the U.S. government. To understand how he and thousands like him came to be interned in this tiny western outpost requires an understanding of the complicated link between Italy and America in the years leading up to World War II. Che bella patria, they were told, a beautiful country where money flows like wine. Beginning in the 1880s, Italians arrive in America in unprecedented numbers, fleeing the troubled social, economic, and political conditions in their homeland. A popular saying in Italy at the time is, "He who leaves survives." By the end of World War I, Italians are the largest immigrant group in the United States.
They came here from Italy, my mother and father did, because obviously they wanted to come to the land of opportunity.
They are people who expect little more than a chance at realizing what will come to be known as the American dream.
There were all these posters telling them how wonderful the opportunities were here.
I think the Italians who emigrated were at first seized with keen disappointment because the stories had been so inviting. The streets were paved with gold. The letters written home spoke of economic opportunity.
But letters also speak of the poverty and isolation that plague all immigrants in the early 1900s. There is opportunity for a hard-working family to carve out a niche of the American dream, but there is also prejudice and resentment towards the nearly 2 million Italians living and working in a growing immigrant underclass. A modicum of respect for America's Italian population finally comes from an unlikely source. In 1922, Benito Mussolini's new fascist regime captivates the world. Through progressive reforms, Mussolini revitalizes Italy's role as a political and cultural world power. Italians in America now have a bona fide hero in the old country.
He was physically imposing. He had a presence. He had a charisma. He had a wonderful eloquence, which was very persuasive.
When he was speaking, we all gathered in the big plazas and listened to him. I believe the people really trust him, and they were willing to do anything that he would ask them to do.
When Mussolini first started out, he was thought to be a great man, both by Italians and by others. I mean, the American press lauded him. At one time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt thought that Mussolini was a great leader and that we should emulate him.
In fact, President Roosevelt sends members of his cabinet to learn from Mussolini's highly successful government programs, including a system of social security. In return, Mussolini sends his son Vittorio to America, where he is feted from coast to coast. For Italian Americans, this is a signal that they have entered the mainstream.
This man was doing something right, it seemed. Cole Porter even sang about it. In 1934, he wrote the song, "You're the Tops, You're Mussolini," only to change it the next year after the invasion of Ethiopia by Mussolini.
When Italy invades Ethiopia in 1935, respect is replaced by contempt. Americans realize that Mussolini's fascistic regime is attempting to do more than keep the trains running on time. And when Italy signs the so-called Pact of Steel with Germany, Mussolini's unholy alliance with Hitler and the Nazis instantly changes him from saint to Satan in the minds of America. For Italian Americans, such an instantaneous change of heart is more difficult.
There was a lack of understanding of immigrants and what it meant when they were loyal to their countries of origin.
In the 1930s, a majority of Italians in the United States become naturalized citizens. But many have yet to overcome the language barrier, and for other personal reasons haven't yet taken that step. Some Americans see it as a betrayal of their adopted country.
You don't come to this country and you instantly become American. It takes a while. The immigrant is living in two cultures.
The sentiments of 2 million Italian Americans hang suspended between love for their adopted country and a growing fear for loved ones still in their homeland. Then, with the outbreak of war in September 1939, the loyalties of the Italians living in the United States suddenly become a matter of concern for the State Department and the FBI.
There was a lot of crying and a lot of praying.
President Roosevelt asks FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to compile a list of people to be arrested in the event of a national emergency. This custodial detention list, known as the ABC list, is compiled hastily and indiscriminately.
The A, B, and C lists were compilations of names of people who were aliens from potential belligerent nations who bore watching.
So they started with Germans and then they did Italians, and it allows the government in time of war to pick up or detain non-citizens, really without cause, but non-citizens who are citizens of countries with which we are at war.
The ABC list remains a secret inventory in the back pocket of U.S. intelligence for nearly 2 years. Then, in March of 1941, under growing pressure to protect America from involvement in the growing war in Europe, President Roosevelt is forced to confront the question of potential enemies on American soil. As it turns out, an Italian birthplace or simply an Italian-sounding last name will be all that is required to turn friend into foe. On March 30th, 1941, under growing pressure to expel any persons considered a threat to America, President Roosevelt takes decisive action against Italians in America who are literally sitting ducks.
The Coast Guard boarded a number of ships at various ports on the Pacific coast and the East Coast.
Italian merchant seamen whose ships were in U.S. ports at the time war was declared in Europe are anchored, unable to return home, unwelcome to debark in America. President Roosevelt orders the seizure of 28 Italian ships, as well as German and Danish vessels in American waters.
And the fear was these ships would be damaged, rendered inoperative, and therefore would serve as blockades in the harbor.
Life magazine calls it the first U.S. military action of World War II, and the Coast Guard finds justification for its actions: widespread acts of sabotage on many of the Italian ships. Engine room boilers are damaged and propeller shafts cut. 1,200 Italian crewmen are arrested at gunpoint. A handful of suspected vandals are scheduled to be tried for sabotage and deported. The rest are held in custody by the Immigration Department. Giovanni Pelli is a 17-year-old deckhand on the freighter Arsa.
One of the Coast Guard, he asked me who I was. He put the bayonet on in my stomach. I want to argue with him. I said, buddy, he said, that thing is too sharp for me. But some of them guys, you know, they scare the living heck out of us, you know.
The alleged sabotage of the Italian ships is all the government needs to embark on an aggressive campaign against aliens in America. Even in the U.S.-controlled Panama Canal, the Italian luxury liner Conte Biancomano is boarded and impounded. Its crew of 483 Italian nationals, most of them teenagers and young men, is taken into custody. Umberto Benedetti is a woodworker on board the Biancomano.
We did not expect that. That took us on surprise. They put in jail all the crew, was very, very bad, very bad.
All of the Italian seamen are taken to Ellis Island. Their view of the New York skyline is through windows with bars on them. The living conditions are terribly crowded. For them, the future is uncertain.
1,600 people, walk in such a big room, step over each other. It took me about a month and a half before I can ever change my undershirt and my T-shirt.
What makes this particularly ironic is that Ellis Island, in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty, the entry point to this bastion of liberty, should be the place of incarceration for so many. While we were fighting for the democratic process, constitutional rights, the American way of life, we, faced by the possible threat of sabotage and wartime danger, abrogated many of those rights.
With nearly 2,000 Italian sailors in custody, the government next turns its attention to aliens on American soil. The first to be arrested are 62 Italian waiters who had originally come in 1939 to work in the Italian pavilion at the New York World's Fair and have now overstayed their visas. Alfredo Cipolato of Venice, Italy, is among those who worked at the World's Fair.
I was very surprised and mad. He arrested me. I wasn't doing nothing, just I was working. Anyway, I spent a month in jail. He sent me down to Ellis Island.
The men languish at Ellis Island for as much as 3 months before a decision is made about their fate. Instead of deporting the men to be conscripted into the Axis fighting forces, the U.S. government instead devises an alternative that sets a historic precedent. The men are transferred from Ellis Island to Grand Central Station, where they are loaded onto trains that have bars on the windows and FBI agents on board. Destination unknown.
The train was like Monte Carlo, not much air, smaller windows with the bars on it.
It was a regular train that we used to use for criminal.
We don't talk each other. It was very silent because one of the FBI on one side, the other FBI on the other side. I think it took 75 hours coming through New York to Missoula.
The Italians begin to arrive in Missoula, Montana on May 9, 1941. This is their new home, an internment camp set up at the U.S. Army's Fort Missoula. It had been established as an Army outpost in the Bitterroot Mountain Range during the Indian Wars of the 1880s. It was abandoned after World War I, only to be used as a regional center for the Civilian Conservation Corps until 1941.
When the first internees arrived at Fort Missoula, they said, "Que bella vista." What a lovely view. And that became their name for the camp.
After 3 days and nights in blacked-out cattle cars, even a military prison has an aura of freedom about it. But the internees' elation is to be short-lived.
It was surrounded by 2,400 feet of chain-link fence, interrupted at intervals by guard towers, and there was as well a 50-foot searchlight tower which oversaw the facility.
The government does not consider the Italians to be prisoners of war. Instead, they are classified as detainees or internees. Many of those here consider it just a difference in semantics.
For the United States, they call you internee. For us, we were prisoners. I said, what are we doing here behind this fence?
According to the United States, we wish to be guests of the United States of America.
The Fort Missoula internment camp becomes its own small city.
There was a library, a theater, 2 mess halls. There was also a hospital established. Medical equipment was brought in.
We had our own priests. We had our own cooks. We had our shoemakers. We had our barbers. You name it, we had it.
An official from the Italian consulate in Seattle arrives to inspect the conditions at Fort Missoula. He says, "Our seamen are very fortunate indeed to have such a wonderful location at Fort Missoula for the detention station. The climate is ideal, and everyone is being so very nice to them." But despite this glowing report bordering on propaganda, Fort Missoula was, after all, still a prison.
We had the freedom inside. I mean, so we could do anything inside, but they can go outside.
As weeks turn into months and the pleasant days of summer turn into a frigid fall and then a typically brutal Montana winter, the internees find little comfort in the amenities at Fort Missoula.
The variety of activities in an enclosed camp in the Bitterroot Mountain Range area was limited, and the internees found that time hung heavy on their hands.
Internees pass the endless hours organizing soccer teams and theater groups. Others pass the time walking the camp boundaries. One internee develops the habit of walking backwards to break the monotony. They write letters home, but their mail is heavily censored, and the prisoners receive almost no communication from family and friends.
According to us, we didn't do nothing wrong, you know. According to the government, we were dangerous people.
The Italians are settling into an awkward but predictable routine at Fort Missoula when the world is shaken by the news of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Literally within hours, new internees, both Italian and Italian-American, will be on the road to Fort Missoula. And 600,000 more will be treated as enemy aliens in a different kind of prison of America's making.
It shakes your faith in the Constitution that come wartime, the Constitution doesn't mean a thing.
The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor sets off a rapid-fire chain of events that propels the United States into a Second World War. As shockwaves from Pearl Harbor are spreading across a stunned country, the U.S. government casts a wider net over resident aliens from belligerent countries. In addition to the continuing internment of Italian Americans at Fort Missoula, the government begins systematically censoring any and all people even remotely connected to foreign interests.
The FBI began compiling information on people they felt might be potential adversaries.
Police officers and FBI agents carrying hastily telexed search warrants begin arresting resident aliens from Italy, Germany, and Japan within 24 hours of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Questions beginning with why go unanswered.
It was discovered that some of the Italian nationals living in California, for example, had been taken away during the night. No warning, no message, no communication from them. Doors had been opened, they had been summoned.
Age, infirmity, or any kind of actual probable cause carry no weight with the arresting agency. Suspicion is enough to put anyone behind bars.
Carmelo Ilacqua was arrested because he had worked at the Italian consulate. The FBI came to arrest him. In the file it says, we searched his desk for incriminating papers, but they didn't find any. His daughter, who was 6, had a little desk of her own. She said, do you want to look at my desk too?
Some were taken in handcuffs to staging areas. Those with families were allowed a telephone call, but the families knew not what was going to happen. By December 8th, December 9th, they found that their assets had been frozen, their sources of support, their breadwinners were gone. Felipe Fortelona's wife had an inkling that he'd been taken by the government, not knowing exactly where he was. And we went to offer some kind of consolation, found her at her home in Los Angeles with her 3 little girls tugging at her skirt, and all the while saying, mi mari, ma dove mi mari? Meaning, my husband, where is my husband?
In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, detained Italians are brought before a federal judicial hearing board, but are not permitted to have an attorney or even to know the charges against them. Most are moved to holding facilities where they are held for as long as 1 year. Others are sent to internment camps.
Those who could not pass the scrutiny of the local hearing board were then sent to the larger internment camps, including Fort Lincoln and Fort Missoula or Crystal City, Texas.
A state of war.
Life gets even worse for resident aliens when on December 12, 1941, the United States officially declares war on the Axis powers. Now not just those on the ABC list, but every single immigrant from Italy, Germany, and Japan who is not yet naturalized is considered a potential threat. All are required to register with the government and are subject to significant restrictions. At the time, there are 600,000 Italian aliens living in the United States.
It meant you had to carry a card with your picture and your thumbprint, like you were maybe a criminal.
There was so much confusion and fright. There was so much fear.
Very few of the people required to register are newcomers to America. Most have been living in the United States for 20 years or more. They are the mothers and fathers of American-born children, many of whom are fighting in the U.S. Armed Forces. But this is of little consequence when the U.S. government next begins imposing a series of restrictions on these so-called enemy aliens.
These included no air travel without permission, no travel from township to township, no changing of employment without notifying the federal government. Enemy aliens were not to be found near harbor facilities, railroad lines, any airports, any military installations.
In addition, enemy aliens are required to turn over all possessions the U.S. military now considers contraband. These include firearms, shortwave radios, and cameras. Even seemingly mundane items like flashlights, which the government has determined could be used as signaling devices, are taken away. In 1941, Velio Alberto Bronzini is 13 years old, living with his family in Oakland, California. He remembers the day the police came to his house.
There was a knock on the door, and there were two policemen standing there. They said, "We have to take your Philco radio." I distinctly remember my mother pleading with the policemen, and she was hysterical. Their brand new Philco radio, why would anybody want to take it? It's not a threat to be listening to music or anything else on a radio.
Under pressure from certain reactionary elements in Congress and the military, President Roosevelt is motivated to do more than fingerprint and take away radios. He signs Executive Order 9066 in February 1942, authorizing the U.S. military to restrict the movements of anyone deemed a threat to America. But with literally hundreds of thousands of resident aliens living along the eastern seaboard, the order is seen as more lip service than a call to arms. However, in California, Executive Order 9066 has a tremendous effect.
Many people have asked, why did so much occur on the Pacific coast and not elsewhere?
The answer is to be found in the person of Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, head of the Western Defense Command.
DeWitt was a very paranoid Army general who had never seen warfare himself, but wanted to cleanse the state of California, at least, of all the, quote, enemy alien groups.
DeWitt was convinced of imminent attack along the Pacific coast, and therefore he was adamant about enforcing 9066 across the board and interning the entire enemy alien population.
Some people call him General Dimwit instead of DeWitt. He wanted to get all the Germans and all the Italians out.
Japanese nationals and Japanese Americans become the most well-publicized target. More than 110,000 will be interned in 1942. But at the same time, the Italian population is also coming under more direct attack. General DeWitt's first solution to the Italian problem is to impose a region-wide curfew on all resident aliens.
The curfew imposed two limits. One was on travel, not beyond 5 miles except for employment, and no travel between 8 o'clock at night and 6 in the morning. Employment at night was not an excuse. People simply had to give up their jobs in restaurants, as janitors, whatever it might be.
And overnight, the California fishing industry, the source of employment for thousands of Italian families, is virtually shut down when DeWitt excludes all enemy aliens from ships, boats, and even dinghies.
Some of them lost their boats. Others found their boats requisitioned by the Coast Guard. One way or another, their fishing life had come to an end.
There was a great need during the war for all the food that we could provide. There came a shortage of food, and there were posters issued by the Office of War Information that said, "Fish is a fighting food. We need more fish." And it was very ironic because that came out shortly after the Italians were prohibited from fishing.
But the worst is yet to come. Dissatisfied with restrictions alone, Lieutenant General John DeWitt begins a sinister campaign to ruin the economic lives of Italian families throughout the West. The United States' entry into World War II affects every aspect of national life. Women are called to do the work of men. Food and gasoline are rationed. And even the national pastime, baseball, is voluntarily put on hold. Joe DiMaggio, the Yankee Clipper, ends 1941 with a record-breaking hitting streak and begins 1942 in the United States Army. Along with his brothers Dominic and Vince, Joe DiMaggio is hailed as an American hero. What people don't know, however, is that as the DiMaggio boys are fighting for their country, their father is foundering.
The DiMaggio family is often used as an example of what happened during the war. Mr. DiMaggio was a fisherman, and so he could not fish.
In addition to restrictions on fishing, travel, and the imposition of a curfew, in February 1942, Lieutenant General John DeWitt, head of the Western Defense Command, designates vast tracts of land, including entire towns, as military zones, and as such, they are now off-limits to all resident aliens. Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco is one of the new military zones.
Joe and Vince DiMaggio owned a restaurant at Fisherman's Wharf. The DiMaggio father, neither he nor his wife could go where the restaurant was located on Fisherman's Wharf because that area was prohibited to them.
During a House Judiciary hearing in 1999, youngest brother Dominic DiMaggio recalls his father's experience.
I remember my dad was forbidden from fishing or even visiting his friends at the wharf because it was a prohibited zone. I do not know the extent, but I am sure that Dad was terribly hurt after his experience as an enemy alien. It saddens me to think that my mother and Dad were considered enemy aliens by the country they adored so very much.
And the experience of the DiMaggio family is shared by thousands of others throughout the West, including the Bronzini family in Oakland, California.
My father's market was on the west side of East 12th Street, and it was declared that the center line on East 12th Street was to be the dividing line between what was the restricted zone and non-restricted zone. And unfortunately for him, his market was in the restricted zone. So ultimately, the market closed. He was told in plain English that this was an order that came from the federal government and that there was just nothing that could be done.
People lost their jobs. People could not go from their one community to another. And people were not being given jobs because of their enemy alien status.
One moment, he's a hardworking, productive, industrious individual, and the next moment, the American dream came to a screeching halt.
Families living in prohibited zones not only lose their businesses, but also their homes. The evacuation of more than 10,000 Italian-American families in California happens swiftly, without warning. In one instance, an American-born GI, the son of Italian parents, returns on leave to find his Pittsburgh, California home empty. A bedridden 97-year-old man is removed from his home by force, bed and all.
For some, the seriousness came in a very dramatic way. They felt that they were being accused of not being loyal Americans, that they were shamed by this accusation. And in several cases, they took their lives. In one instance, a man left a note that he simply could not endure the status that had been imposed upon him, that he thought himself a good American, and he threw himself in front of a speeding train. Another shot himself. Several others took their lives as well. It was a time of trauma. It was a time of trial. It was a time that we really cannot forget.
And all the time, there is more suspicion and more arrests. A climate of fear grips Italian-American communities throughout the country.
There was an active effort to discourage speaking the enemy's language, as was said. There were signs placed in store windows, "Will not speak Italian for the duration of the war."
Throughout the spring and summer of 1942, innuendo and rumor are enough to justify an arrest. In some cases, business rivals use this as an opportunity to eliminate a competitor. Whispering campaigns carry tremendous weight, and no one is immune. This is illustrated dramatically when world-famous opera star Ezio Pinza is arrested on March 12, 1942.
We never suspected that this could happen in the United States.
Pinza, a resident alien under contract to the Metropolitan Opera in New York City, is arrested without knowing the charges. His home is searched, and he is imprisoned at the Ellis Island detention facility.
The terror of being arrested and imprisoned without knowing the charges against him, the fear that he could be separated from his family for years and lose his career, and the difficult conditions on Ellis Island contributed, I am sure, to the high blood pressure and heart ailment that eventually took his life at the young age of 64.
Pinza is held in a crowded dormitory with hundreds of other suspected enemy aliens for more than 3 months before pressure from the media and New York society patrons influence his release. Less well-known Italians are not so lucky. For many of them, arrest and detention are merely a prelude to internment.
My grandfather was arrested because he was suspected of being a fascist.
Julie Scopazzi's grandfather is Angelo Baccocina, a journalist and host of a weekly Italian radio program in San Francisco.
He was accused of spy activities, for lack of a better word, because nobody really knows why he was arrested.
There was no need. He was not a criminal.
Baccocina writes home to Italy and tells his wife and daughter that he is in jail.
It was embarrassing and very shameful to say that your father was prisoner in America. I know he suffered a lot, but he couldn't say much, in the letters.
I've learned he was in 3 internment camps, one in San Antonio, Texas, one in McAlester, Oklahoma, and another in Missoula, Montana.
But Baccocina was one of the lucky ones. His internment was short-lived.
Somebody realized that he was a professor of Italian, and they granted him his naturalization, and then they moved him from the internment camp in Montana, where he was there because he was accused of being a spy, to Stanford University to teach the top military officers how to speak Italian. So when they would go to Italy during the war and after the war, they would know the language, which was incredibly ironic.
The internment camps, established to house Italian sailors and World's Fair waiters, begin to receive resident aliens and Italian-American citizens who are guilty of no crime but are perceived by the government as potential threats.
I mean, many people excuse it because they say, oh, it was wartime. Well, I don't excuse it. It was a violation of people's rights.
The mood in the camp worsens with each passing day.
He was said to look some of them guys, sometimes you can see an old guy walking, and you can see him cry, because I know what he was thinking about. He was thinking about his family.
In a letter to an internee from his daughter in San Francisco, she writes, "You seem to be more sad than usual. Patience, Daddy. Let's hope this mess will finish before the year is over."
There was, in one case, an attempted suicide. In another, a young internee cast himself from the 3rd floor of the hospital there at the camp and committed suicide.
The man's name is Aurelio Mariani. He is not yet 30 years old when he decides to end his life.
The note he left behind simply said, "I am tired of being kept like a caged chicken."
In May 1942, California State Assemblyman Jack Tenney spearheads a government investigation into reports of un-American activities and subversive activity by Italian aliens. The hearings reach almost farcical heights when Tenney calls into question the activities of Italian-American Angelo Rossi, the mayor of San Francisco. Rossi angrily appears before the committee to denounce reports that he has been seen giving a fascist salute. Rossi proclaims his undying loyalty to the United States and lashes out at what he says is the racist and inherently un-American activities of the committee itself. Rossi's denouncement reverberates in Washington, D.C., where East Coast politicians like New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia are already calling for an end to enemy alien status for Italians in the U.S.
There were some practical matters that the administration considered. There was a congressional by-election coming that fall, and it was important that there be the support of the Italian people that would hardly be gained if there was a general internment.
While the Italian internment debate continues through the summer of 1942, Attorney General Francis Biddle is openly challenging the Defense Department and the FBI. Biddle publicly proclaims that restrictions are no longer necessary and exceeded legal limits when they were instituted.
Attorney General Francis Biddle is the only hero in this story that I know of in the government. Biddle fought against what the Army wanted to do, particularly what General DeWitt wanted. He didn't want people removed.
Biddle and his supporters finally convince FDR to change his policy in late August.
It was decided there'd be a major address on Columbus Day, 1942, at Carnegie Hall in New York City, at which Francis Biddle, the Attorney General, would make this announcement.
Italians who are not American citizens will be no longer classed as alien enemies.
And he said, we have watched you for 8 months, and we know you Italians are not enemies. And so we declare you enemy aliens no more.
The era of restrictions and exclusions ends as abruptly as it began just 9 months before. But in a nod to the efforts and political influence of Jack Tenney and Lieutenant General John DeWitt, President Roosevelt agrees to the continued internment of those already behind bars. For most Italian internees, freedom will have to wait until the end of the war with Italy in 1943. Only then will camps like Fort Missoula close and the Italians held there be allowed to return home. Many decide to remain in the United States, but their story and the story of thousands of other Italians in America during World War II begins to slip through the cracks of history.
This story has been a secret story because of a number of factors. One is that many Italians wanted to be done with it, that doubt had been cast upon their loyalty as Americans in time of war was something they wanted to forget and certainly not share with their children.
My mother probably suffered more than any of us did. She ended up having a total mental collapse over this thing. She used to say, non è giusta, non è giustizia, non abbiamo fatto niente a nessuno. This is not justice. We have done nothing to no one. Why are they doing this to us?
Una storia segreta, a secret story, is the phrase still used by some Italian Americans when referring to the period of restriction, exclusion, and internment. And this secret story may never have been known if not for the recent efforts of a handful of researchers, descendants, and several U.S. congressmen.
We think it's very important that this story not be a secret anymore.
In 1999, House Resolution 2442 was put before Congress by Engel and lead Republican on the resolution, Rick Lazio. It is titled the Wartime Violation of Italian American Civil Liberties Act.
It simply calls on the president to acknowledge the fact that Italian Americans were rounded up and placed in internment camps and had their property confiscated and their jobs confiscated and were in curfew. It calls on the president to acknowledge the fact and also calls on the Justice Department to help in the compilation of data.
I think personally the government should apologize to us. You know, that's all we want. That's all I want. I don't want any money. I don't want anything else.
Even if not an apology, just to be able to say, yes, this did happen, and let the truth be known.
I want everybody to know this happened. It's a black eye in America's history. Let's learn from it. Let's not let it happen again. But don't hide it and say it never happened, because it did.
In November 1999, more than 56 years after the fact, the U.S. House of Representatives passes Resolution 2442. It is, hopefully, the end of this secret story.
It isn't necessarily a wrong that we are righting here. It's rather a loss of memory that we're correcting.
Perhaps finally, the memory of what happened here at Fort Missoula will no longer be the sole responsibility of a former internee named Alfredo Chipolato. He is now an American citizen, and he is still in Missoula more than half a century later. But he still remembers the past and honors those who lost their livelihoods and their lives as a direct result of this secret story.
One action called for in House Resolution 2442 is a full investigation and report by the Justice Department into wartime violations of Italian-American civil liberties. To this end, Representative Eliot Engel and others are hoping that more Italian-Americans affected during World War II will come forward so that una storia segreta will finally be a secret story no more.
Discover more about this and every History's Mysteries topic at historychannel.com.